now going to look into how to perform a risk assessment. So when performing risk assessments, there is 5 steps to performing and carrying out correct risk assessments. Step 1 is looking for hazards. So you need to turn up to your environment and look for all potential hazards within that environment. Step 2, decide who might be harmed and how. Step 3, evaluate the risks. Step 4, record your findings. And step 5, review and revise. So you must complete and follow those 5 steps to risk assessment when you're going to potentially identify hazards, evaluate risks, and then put into account any safety strategies to potentially lower any of the risks. It's your responsibility to regularly review and revise all of your risk assessments, and especially if anything changes within the local environment. When thinking about hazards and risks, a hazard is anything that can cause harm, and the risk is the likelihood of harm and severity of harm. So possible hazards in an outdoor fitness environment that you would potentially need to consider. Things we're going to look at is environment, equipment, working practices, and equipment safety to begin with. With the environment, you've got to consider all trip hazards, uneven surfaces, broken glass, damaged fixtures, temperature, whether it's going to be too hot or too cold, wet and slippery surfaces, dog mess, and other members of the public. With equipment, you've got to consider any faulty or worn out resistance bands, loose dumbbell weights, poor positioning of any of your equipment, and poorly maintained equipment in general. With working practices, you've got to think about insufficient maintenance checks on any of your equipment and the environment. Insufficient risk assessment could potentially put clients at risk. Poor manual handling and lifting practices when setting out your equipment or lifting and using your equipment within your sessions. Poor performance of any safety drills that you need to practice if there's going to be any risks, or if you do need to do any emergency phone calls. And poorly filled out PAR-Q and member records in case you need to get in touch with any members of family. Equipment safety, wiping down mats if used, and stacking and tidying equipment away appropriately, especially if you're putting it back into a van or a car. Some other hazards are clients, client behaviour, and security. When it comes to clients, you've got to obviously consider medical conditions, older adults and disabilities being at slightly higher risk, pre or postnatal and active clients, and anyone with cardiovascular disease risk factors, injuries, deconditioned clients, low skill and fitness level clients, and clients wearing incorrect clothing or footwear could present a risk. Client behaviour such as aggression, drunkenness, lifting heavy weights incorrectly, not cleaning equipment after use, failure to disclose any essential information, unsafe exercise technique, chewing gum, ignoring instructions or guidelines, and again, poor clothing and footwear for outdoor environment. And lastly, when it comes to security hazards, you could think about valuables and equipment being easy to see, which could be putting yourself and clients at risk of theft, and not having a mobile phone for doing any emergency phone calls. So these are all potential possible hazards that you could face within an outdoor fitness environment that you would need to consider within your risk assessments. Assessing risk in an outdoor fitness environment. Risk assessments is a careful examination of what could potentially cause harm to people in the workplace or wherever they're working out. And the aim of a risk assessment is to minimise the potential for accidents or incidents. So when carrying out risk assessments are rated using a numbered system from 1 to 5, according to the likelihood of the risk occurring and the risk severity. These two numbers are multiplied together to give an overall risk rating. So in this table provided, you can see that likelihood, which would be unlikely up to likely, and severity from minor up to major and death is on a scale of 1 to 5. So unlikely being 1 when it comes to likelihood, and very likely of 50% or greater is a level of 5 on likelihood scoring and rating. With severity scoring and rating, a minor injury or a near miss to minor injury is severity of 1, and major injury and disease could be 4, and death would be 5. So by multiplying the two ratings together, you're going to get a risk rating of 1 to 2, which would be a low an acceptable level of no further action required. 3 to 10, which would be tolerable, and medium, which would mean that you're going to have to maintain the controls that you've got in place to make sure that that risk rating doesn't go any higher. And 11 to 25 would be classed as dangerous and high risk, and you should stop immediately. And action is required to put in control measures to bring the risk rating down as much as possible. So this is a process that we would recommend you using when completing your risk assessments. Think about all the hazards and then assess the risk. What is the likelihood and what is the severity? And that should give you an overall risk rating. If anything's more than a low to medium risk, you should think about putting controls into place to see how you could reduce the likelihood or severity of that risk rating. Ideally, all of your risks should be low by the end of your risk assessment. So again, other things that you need to take into account with the weather, especially within outdoor fitness environments, is you've got to consider the rain, the sun, any ice and cold weather and winds, and how this could impact exercises and the environment that you hope to deliver your outdoor fitness sessions in. So you need to consider all potential weather conditions before you deliver any outdoor fitness sessions. And you should do a risk assessment for all extreme weather conditions. Here you can see an example of a risk assessment. So down the left-hand side, you can see the hazards and the potential risks caused by those hazards. You can then see that there's an initial rating using the risk assessment process, low, medium, or high, and then some existing control measures that have been put into place to then do a final rating on the right-hand side. So if we have a quick look, you can see that in the outdoor environment, there's some uneven ground. So this could potentially cause risk to all of your clients and participants, and it could be a sprained ankle from any trips or falls potentially. So this would be classed as a medium risk due to all clients being fairly likely to causing themselves a minor injury. So again, existing control measures that you can put into place is a pre-check of the ground to make sure that you're reducing, taking away any sticks and stones to reduce the likelihood of a trip or a fall. Also doing a pre-check before the session starts of shoes and laces, trying and cone off and avoid any areas of unevenness, teach the group how to run over uneven ground, and perform mark and purser call-outs if people do find any particular points that are uneven. This would reduce the likelihood of any hazards, and this would bring the overall risk rating down to a low. So you can see there's some other examples here for sun, dehydration, bad weather, and incorrect use of equipment with poor posture. So these are just some potential hazards and risks and their overall initial ratings, followed by some existing control measures and their overall final rating. This is something that we would expect you to perform when it comes into risk assessing your outdoor area for your clients' outdoor fitness sessions. Controlling risks associated with hazards in a fitness environment. Controlling a risk may require you to use a less hazardous procedure, install or use machinery, wear protective clothing, and eliminate a hazard altogether. This can be quite difficult in an outdoor fitness environment, so you've got to think about the less hazardous procedures and potentially trying to eliminate a hazard altogether if possible. The first consideration is obviously to eliminate the risk if possible. And if you can't control the hazard or risk, you need to contact the person or the council that is responsible for health and safety within that outdoor environment. Another useful piece of information is the UK Active Code of Conduct. This code of conduct covers health and safety, exercise professionals, and customer care when it comes to delivering outdoor fitness sessions. We've made a downloadable copy of this code of conduct available to you within this unit for you to look through in your own time. That's the end of the risk assessment sessions. We're now going to look into the next set of sessions, which is instructing outdoor fitness, as well as giving all the information to your clients ahead of sessions to make sure they're well informed about their sessions. We're now going to be looking at some risk assessment considerations within the local park area when you're thinking about using this as a potential outdoor fitness environment for your sessions.
I'm now going to take you through with my handheld camera and be looking at some potential risk assessment considerations that you might need to think about. Okay, so one thing you would need to consider is the weather. As you can see, been blessed with a lucky sunny day when recording this for the modules. That's not always the case. So it's probably quite important for you guys to always look at the weather forecast and consider what the weather is going to be like for your outdoor sessions. That way you could potentially advise your clients on what kind of footwear or what clothing to wear to make sure that they're safe within your outdoor sessions that you've planned. So if it's going to be particularly wet, you want to make sure they've got some nice grippy footwear for any outdoor running or any outdoor exercise, or as well as potentially having some waterproof layers and a change of clothing for after the session. Another thing to think about is always thinking about giving some advice on footwear. So think about any footwear and how you can maybe ensure that footwear is going to have a nice grip to the bottom of it when doing any outdoor fitness sessions, and making sure that they maybe don't wear their brand new shoes if it's going to be running in particularly muddy and wet conditions. Other things to think about when it's part of the risk assessment is always making sure your client brings along some water. It might be worth you bringing along quite a large couple of bottles of water just to make sure that your clients do have access to drinking water, because you're not going to have access to water fountains or local sort of water drinking facilities that you might have within a gym or a personal training studio. So it's always making sure that you give that information to your client to make sure that they're suitably equipped with water to keep them hydrated within their sessions. So we're now going to do a quick walk around the local environment just to do a little bit of a risk assessment. So things you want to look for are sort of sticks and stones and anything that's going to be a sort of trip hazard or a trip object within the local environment. So you might want to come along a little bit earlier ahead of your session starting and making sure that you do a little bit of a trip hazard and a risk assessment in the local area. So make sure there's not any sharp objects or anything either, and you might even want to invest in a sharps kit to make sure that you can remove any maybe smashed glass or smashed bottles away from the area if that's required. If you're going to be using some of the local environment, it's worth coming along and just checking the stability, making sure that the actual benches are strong enough to be doing any equipment within the benches if possible, making sure there's not any sort of sharp edges or any sort of like splinter risks or cut risks when it comes to using some of the equipment. If you're going to be using any of the other equipment, again, just make sure you do a little mini risk assessment on that. If you're going to be using anything for dip stations or crawling under, crawling over, stepping on or stepping off any of the equipment. Again, if you're going to be using any sort of objects like a rig, for example, which you can see in this outdoor park that we've got access to, just always make sure that you're going to be doing quick sort of checks, making sure that everything's strong, everything's safe before you then get any of your clients doing any sort of body weight exercises on that piece of equipment. Again, you just want to do a quick sort of surface check, make sure everything's kind of safe ahead of the session, make sure that you've kind of got all that sort of environment checked before you do any physical activity with your clients. Another thing to think about as part of your risk assessment is just making sure that any equipment that you do plan to use is safe and fit for purpose. So always do a little bit of a recce and a little bit of check on any equipment that you plan to use within your session, just to make sure that there's no wear and tear or any sort of injury risks when it comes to the clients potentially using that equipment within your session. And the last couple of considerations that you need to think about when it comes to risk assessing and delivering any physical activity outdoors is going to be carrying a first aid kit, just in case there is any small injuries or cuts or bruises or grazes, as well as having a fully charged mobile phone, just to make sure that if there is any issues that you've always got access to making a quick emergency phone call. So these are another 2 pieces of essential kit that you always need to have at your fingertips when delivering any outdoor fitness sessions.